Now, what do you think of when you hear the word, okay, boomer? For me, that conjures up images of people like my grandparents, right? Old, elderly people who are maybe out of touch. So the question becomes, what is a baby boomer, right? And just before we move on, I want to take a second to appreciate the Simpsons meme because I will always take the opportunity to do that. But essentially, baby boomers are the children of the veterans of the Second World War. We can see like this iconic photo of a sailor returning home from the war. There's actually an interesting article about this on NPR. They didn't know each other. He just grabbed this random lady off the street and kissed her. So that's worth noting. But we have a generation of veterans returning, and suddenly there's a baby boom, and we're going to figure out why that is today. So, a couple of reasons that we can look at are economic. So, we can start by looking at the gross domestic product. Now, GDP is a way to measure a country's economic success. So, we can see just how much a country is producing each quarter by the GDP. So, let's take a look and zoom in real quick. So, we're going to start by zooming in on 1947. If we remember, World War II ends in 45. So the GDP is fairly low, right? It's a little bit over here below the 0%. And then by 1949, it suddenly spikes dramatically, right? So we have this huge rise in economic wealth. And the reason for this is that during World War II, everybody had to go to work. All the factories were mobilized. The troops are coming home. They have money in their pocket they can spend. World War II breaks the Great Depression. World War II allows America to get back on its feet. So 2 reasons for the baby boom. Could be the post-war money that comes in from all the factory jobs and the end of the Great Depression. I would argue that there's probably 2 other big reasons for the baby boom. And we're going to take a look at each of them separately. So the first one is the GI Bill. So GI stands for Government Issue. If you've ever seen GI Joe, it stands for Government Issue Joe. So the GI Bill basically paid for the education of veterans. If we take a look at this chart, right, in 1940, most veterans had less than high school education, right? A huge, substantial percentage of them, right? Same with African Americans, right? The vast majority of African Americans did not have access to higher education. But by 1960, look at how low the numbers get, right? This gets to, sorry, I kind of made it so I can't see. This gets to about 50%. By 1980, it's like half of that, and it keeps getting lower. And the same thing happens to African American veterans, but at a lower scale. And similar reasons for this could be that African Americans were disenfranchised by the Roosevelt administration, which we've talked about. And Truman actually desegregates the military. So it could be Truman's policies towards the end of the war start helping with this, but there's a couple other factors. But we'll get into that a little bit later. But with more education, people tend to have more money, they tend to settle down more, and this could be a reason that people start having kids, right? People who ordinarily would have gone straight to a factory maybe died working in a factory, are suddenly able to get these higher paying jobs. The second reason I would argue is affordable housing. Because the Great Depression had taken out so many houses, right? And so many people were out of work, the housing market goes down. The government helps pay for veterans to move into new areas. We have the first development of the suburbs, right? The suburbs start allowing all sorts of people to move in and start houses. Most people still live in suburbs today. There is a concept called redlining, which we won't talk about hugely. But redlining was a policy where developers would exclude African Americans. So it's worth noting they're not really given access to a lot of these post-war booms that we take for granted. So I just want to keep that in the back of our mind, and we'll get into that more in class. But so overall, we see that between the years 1945 and 1960, there's this massive growth in the population, right? Especially right here around 1947, the end of the war, there's this massive baby boom. And this is really the reason for the baby boomers, who are just now retiring today. And that's why there's all those conflicts between old baby boomers and the younger generations. So hopefully this provided a little bit of helpful background information.